if you could sum it up for the viewers and listeners, what's the one thing you want them to take away from this document and from the kind of the suite of new documents that you've pulled together?
We can have nice things. And we can treat our economy as though it's not a mystical kind of place that we want to wall off. It is in fact the real world in which all of us live. And it should be open to democracy in the same way that every other area of policy is. We should not let the people who are currently laughing their way to the bank, benefiting from the status quo, tell us what is possible.
Kia ora koutou, and a warm welcome to episode 11 of Locked Out with Craig Rennie. By day, I'm the economist and director of policy for the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions. But by night, this podcast looks at the numbers in New Zealand and asks the hard questions so that you can too. We hope that you're enjoying the show and that what we do at Locked Out, if you like the analysis you hear on the show and think that others would too, then recommend us to your friends or even your enemies. Also, give us a recommendation wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps get the word out. Here at Locked Out, we're always really interested in what our viewers and listeners want to know. If it's making you say, if only we could have foreseen being held to ransom by overseas oil interests, you can be in no doubt we're asking it too. So get in touch. I'm on X, Blue Sky, and on Substack. We want to hear how we can better help you understand what's really going on and help you navigate the numbers being thrown around by politicians and experts alike. Now, we're very fortunate on the show today to have Green Party co-leader, MP for Auckland Central, and all-round policy nerd, Chlöe Swarbrick. Chlöe has kindly agreed to talk with us about the recently released Green Party Fiscal Strategy and her view of why we need to change how we invest in public services in New Zealand. The Green Fiscal Strategy is the latest in a series of documents from the Green Party setting out their alternative view of all things economic. From an alternative budget to an alternative green industrial strategy, the Green Party is laying out its case for why we need radical reform in New Zealand. Certainly, the results from the economy right now would suggest that some kind of reform is essential. Rising job seeker numbers, a flagging economy, and rising child poverty all point to a country pointing in the wrong direction. The role of the state in trying to manage these issues is being continuously diminished by this government, so perhaps a different approach might reap a different outcome. I'll be setting out my views on the Green Fiscal Strategy in my Substack very soon. But today, I want to give Chlöe an opportunity to talk about that strategy more in depth and to have an opportunity to tell you why they think change is needed. What I will say right now is that there's much in the document to commend, and that this is a serious attempt to try and think differently about how we might manage our current fiscal challenges. Whilst others might decry the Green Party's economic documents as fantasy economics, I wouldn't. I would say that those who believe in untrammeled market forces and repeated cuts to public services are actually the ones indulging in fairy tales. Now, fiscal policy is something that many people write off as too complicated or esoteric to understand. That's a mistake. And any contribution to a better debate in New Zealand about how we grow and invest in a better economy is welcome. So let's talk to Chlöe now. Thank you very much for joining. I'm really glad to be here with Chlöe Swarbrick, co-leader of the Green Party, Auckland Central MP, a person who read the fiscal strategy to me in a room in the Wellington Museum. Can I just say how much I'm enjoying being in a room with someone who clearly enjoys fiscal policy as much as me?
Oh, we love the pointy heads, Craig.
It's honestly, it's a wonderful thing. But can you tell me, sort of, very roughly, what's the current problem with fiscal policy right now in New Zealand, and what needs to change?
Yeah, so in a nutshell, there were quite substantial changes to the way that we did fiscal policy about 40 years ago, and a lot of people will know that this is associated to changes made to the likes of the Public Finance Act, and particularly how we've interpreted the notion of what prudence means. So what we've tried to do with the succession of documents that we've released over the past kind of 7 or 8 or so months, starting with Hiara Ana Mata, which was our alternative emissions reduction plan, hold that one up, and then our green industrial strategy, and then our green budget, and now with real economic responsibility, our alternative fiscal strategy is to show people that a better world is possible, because I can feel that real sense of hopelessness that is definitely cementing in our communities at the moment, especially with the death by 1,000 callous cuts approach that this government is taking. So what the fiscal strategy in particular does is basically use the orthodox calculus or rules of the Treasury and of the IMF and say, you're applying your own rules wrong. And there's actually a lot more headroom here for us to have a far more sophisticated and mature conversation about debt and what debt is used for, because we would agree that actually debt is used incredibly unproductively if you're using it for tax cuts, as Nicola Willis has, which has not created one job. But if we are going to use debt to actually build our real world economic resilience and invest in, for example, our infrastructure, which, that kind of government spending has massive multipliers for our communities, then that's a really good thing. And actually, international debt markets and credit ratings agencies recognize that. So we were firstly going, your rules, we can apply them in a way that actually gives us far more room and scope to do these things, which actually improve people's lives and ensure that we can rapidly reduce climate changing emissions. And we can beat you at the rules of your own game.
I love it. I mean, one of the things I really like about the document is you mentioned the risks of underinvestment.
Yeah.
Right? We measure the costs of debt excellent to the second decimal place, but we never measure the cost of not investing.
Totally.
Right? And I just wonder at all, can you take me through your thinking about that underinvestment risk and how it plays out in New Zealand?
Yeah, hugely. So there's kind of an asymmetry in the way that Treasury approaches these issues. And, it's actually quite ironic given that we tend to have this vernacular around the likes of cost benefit analysis or otherwise. But, if you think about the kind of shorthand and immediate measures and metrics that not only the boffins at Treasury will look at, but also that inform public policy making, they tend to be the likes of kind of OBGAL and our debt to GDP ratios, which are very short-term insights into kind of the immediate spending, but not the benefits of that spending, especially further down the track. So I think it was actually you yourself who I've heard saying, in the past that Treasury can tell you exactly how much it'll cost to build a hospital, right down to the bricks, but they won't tell you the cost of not building that hospital and the impacts that will have on our regional communities. So, that's precisely what we're proposing in our fiscal strategy, is to say we can do things a heck of a lot better. And that means taking into account the real world benefit of improving our real world productive capacity, that is kind of creating actual jobs for people and more flourishing regions. And that in turn increases our resilience, which actually can help us to prepare ourselves as a buffer against those shocks, which Treasury also very conservatively overestimates in their current projections.
I mean, one of the things for me from reading the fiscal strategy is, I think one of the things it's really saying is that we need to do value for money analysis so much better.
And so real value for money analysis,
so much more coherently than we currently do right now. And essentially, rather than letting decision makers off the hook by saying, oh no, there's a limit, we can't go above that limit for reasons. If we did proper value for money analysis, we'd actually work out whether or not we want things.
And that's kind of a thing which at that launch that I just kind of stumbled upon as I was thinking through all of this. I've spent now the better part of nearly 10 years in politics. And I've been involved in all kinds of controversial areas, from kind of drug law reform to mental health and housing and otherwise. But I've never encountered an area of public policy that is treated with as much mysticism as economics. But the deep irony of that, right, is that, this is kind of a similar realization to what I had back in the midst of time when I was in the privileged position of getting into law school, where I was like, holy heck, there's all of this jargon and terminology that is kind of created to stratify society and place certain people on these pedestals where only they, from their ivory towers, are allowed to say what is possible. And this is kind of also one of the central premises of us putting out this fiscal strategy, which notably is the definitely more imbued in jargon kind of piece of work that we have put out over the last kind of 8 months or so. But it is to really demonstrate that there is currently a world of difference between these made up arbitrary fiscal rules and the real world economy. because you don't need to be an economist to see that right now we have massive problems as a country with the infrastructure challenges, with 500,000 New Zealanders accessing food banks every single month, with 191 New Zealanders on the plane offshore every single day. That is our real world economy, but it is being created because politicians like Nicola Willis have created these rules which are even more conservative than Treasury is saying, and they are completely divorced from our real world economy, but also stymieing that real world economy.
And that sense of those real world constraints, what we call the real resource constraints that exist, those should be the guidelines.
100%.
But also you can move those real world resource constraints if you invest.
Yes.
You can have more people, you can have more housing, you can have a bigger economy if you invest, which then allows you to grow more quickly in a more sustainable way.
And this was the really funny thing, actually, at the time that we put out our green budget, and we were talking about, making necessary investments in our infrastructure otherwise. Some of the kind of conservatively aligned journalists were saying, you're just going to immediately create all of this inflation because you want to pour bucket loads of money into the economy. And I was like, again, that's quite an unsophisticated understanding of how this works. And it's part of the reason that we also produced our green industrial strategy, to show that we understand the connections between these things. Because yes, if you were to overnight just say, hey, look, we're going to pour bucket loads of money into the economy and pretend that these things are going to happen, it's not going to happen. We're not pretending that that's not what we're doing. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that we want to look meaningfully all around our country at where that real world economic capacity actually is currently at, and build that up, whether that be biomass facilities in the Central North Island or otherwise, such that we can create good, meaningful green jobs and actually, again, domestic resilience, which ensures that we're in a far better place than we currently are in the context of the current international turmoil.
And I just thought it was a really refreshing way of hearing that conversation against a conversation that starts with, well, if you have a tax cut, which simply just chucks a whole bunch of resource at a problem, and then you go, well, so you're telling me there's going to be no inflation because you've just given businesses $7+ billion in a tax cut, and then they get to say, great, so I'm now going to spend that. The resources haven't changed. So it's the same way, a different problem. Whereas if you start from the real resource issues, we don't have enough trained builders, people. We don't have enough trained doctors. We don't have enough trained teachers.
We don't have enough trains.
We don't have enough trains. That's very true. And I just wonder at all, sort of, there's one of the things there is that there is quite clearly a complex interaction between fiscal strategy and monetary policy. And one of the things that I couldn't see in the fiscal strategy, but I'm sure you can unpick it a bit more, is how you see that relationship unfolding if you were to take a more considered view of debt and a more considered view of investment.
So I mean, this is a really interesting conversation that I think, particularly in the context of the post-COVID restrictions world, noting COVID, of course, is still with us, in the kind of post-unconventional monetary policy being deployed. And I think in some ways, people can find me on the record being relatively constructively critical with our former Labour-led government about this, noting that, prior to that unconventional monetary policy being deployed, I know that Treasury and RBNZ produced a paper for MOF saying basically that if we were going to see a policy program like this, then we would end up with what the officials call distributional impacts, what normal people would call exacerbated inequality. And that's why people understand monetary policy, and it is a blunt instrument. Most people will also understand monetary policy, the major lever, to be the official cash rate. And the kind of stated intention of monetary policy is typically inflation targeting, right? And obviously this is also a whole other political palaver with regard to maximum sustainable employment being removed by this government.
It should be brought back in.
But again, and there I think is a really valid debate about whether inflation targeting is actually even a plausible thing, and there will be more critique and more discussion that we'll be looking to have in the next few weeks and months and years about that as well. But then further to that point, as you say, whether that mandate should be expanded, because as I've had RBNZ in before he left his position, I asked, and with the removal of that dual mandate and the coming back to kind of inflation targeting, has that actually changed anything about the way that you do things? And he was very clear on the record, well, no. But at the end of the day, monetary policy is a blunt instrument. And if we're simply looking to kind of take heat out of the economy, there are ways to do that with, for example, tax policy, which can be far fairer and far more meticulous.
And that's the thing that I think it's the piece that I wondered about in that fiscal strategy, because you talk about creating the revenue base to support that.
Yeah.
And if you're wanting to work in, right now, we'd need to work in a counter-cyclical economic fashion, simply because the economy, listeners, is not doing well. And
you don't say.
Yeah, you don't say.
How many tractors were there sold in the last month?
You suddenly take tens of billions of dollars out of the economy, and then everyone goes, "Oh, why is there no jobs?"
I know.
It's a shocker. But it's that sense of how you do that in a way that helps, the government fulfill its proper role to smooth demand in the economy, because quite clearly we can invest more right now. We're losing thousands of construction workers overseas. There's a housing crisis.
And health workers as well.
We can do that work, but it's doing it in a way that gives people confidence that, as you say, the inflation and the interest hammer isn't just going to come down.
Isn't looming. Yeah, totally. And that for us is what responsible real world economic management actually looks like. And that's part of the reason that we've really tried to start having this conversation, because to that point around how much mystique the economy is treated with, the economy at the end of the day is just you and me. It's all of us. It's the stuff that we create, the planet that we live on, and the rules that we put in place in order to try and govern those relationships, arguably to get to the certain outcomes that we want. And what are the certain outcomes that we're getting at the moment? Well, this government's using a lot of rhetoric around growth, but what we're in fact seeing is that the real world economic implications, which they have created as a result of their fiscal straitjacket, are contracting our economy and obviously also shaking that confidence for that private investment. And then on top of that, we are also seeing a lot of people losing hope.
Yep.
And we can do a lot better than that.
Well, that confidence, that hope that you talk about bleeds through to a lack of spending, which then bleeds
the
to
animal spirit, Craig.
Which then bleeds to a lack of business investment.
Yeah.
A lack of business investment means fewer jobs.
Totally.
And we go round and round and round that cycle. But if I can just sort of, ask you one final question in this space before I come to my very last question, which is around risk. Because some of the detractors of this particular piece of work would point to people like Liz Truss, who just sort of went, "We don't care," right? As the market can be down.
Totally.
They're right, you're wrong. Just go and do that. And sort of, they would argue that arbitrary rules have a signalling mechanism and a signalling support to say, no, it doesn't really matter. We're not going to go above that level. How do we get past that sort of thinking? How do we get past that sort of, that really quite narrow thinking, that quite narrow risk-based thinking?
First thing, we're not going to do a Liz Truss, because we're not going to overnight just decide to cut all the taxes of the wealthiest people in the country.
That is very fair.
In fact, obviously, we've said that we want to institute a tax plan which will see 91% of New Zealanders pay less income tax and the top 3% pay a wealth tax. And we're obviously finally putting on the table conversations about what it looks like to have a fairer intergenerational tax policy as well with our wealth transfer tax. But secondly, what international credit ratings agencies and debt markets are looking at is fundamentally the credibility and the transparency of government spending plans and our real world economic resilience. And this is a point that a number of economic commentators have made off the back of our fiscal strategy being released out there into the world, is we cannot fathom that there would be a credit rating agency or a debt market that would downgrade us solely because we're investing more money in building our real world economic resilience, which in turn actually reduces the risk, right? So the thing that kind of investment in our healthcare system or in our infrastructure or otherwise can do is actually also minimize the impact of potential shocks, whether they be climate change related or future pandemics or whatever the case may be. So the point that we are making is that the kind of way that risk is presently defined and understood is utter nonsense. It is cooked, and it does not take into account the real world risk that we are generating for ourselves, let alone the real world debt that we are creating for future generations through the climate crisis and through the inequality crisis and through the intergenerational criminality and poverty and homelessness, which we're experiencing today as a result of these austerity-based trickle-down decisions that were made 40 years ago and which Nicola Willis is making today.
So if I could ask you just to sum up, it's very difficult to do. It's a very, it's a very wide area, and we could spend all day talking about it. And trust me, I'd love to. But if you could sum it up for the viewers and listeners, what's the one thing you want them to take away from this document and from the kind of the suite of new documents that you've pulled together?
We can have nice things. And we can treat our economy as though it's not a mystical kind of place that we want to wall off. It is in fact the real world in which all of us live. And it should be open to democracy in the same way that every other area of policy is. We should not let the people who are currently laughing their way to the bank, benefiting from the status quo, tell us what is possible. You know, it's that Ursula Le Guin thing of, you know, capitalism seems inescapable, but so too do the divine right of kings.
Yeah.
You know, any power that is man-made can be resisted and changed by human beings. So the way that I very flippantly say this frequently is that it's all made up. You know, these fiscal rules that Treasury has handed down that, you know, our current conservative politicians have decided to interpret even more narrowly, those are arbitrary and they are made up. But not everything is actually made up. What is real is our children who are currently, you know, struggling to have a sense of stability in their homes. What is really real is the health of our rivers and our waterways. What is really, really real is the fact that we're currently experiencing the flight of New Zealanders who may potentially never return. Those are real things.
1 every 7 minutes, 30 seconds.
He's done the maths.
It's done the maths.
Yes.
It's one thing you can trust me for. Thank you so much for joining us here. I'm really pleased. I hope we can keep having this conversation. I think it's a really important conversation. If you haven't seen it already, have a look. The Real Economic Responsibility, Green Fiscal Strategy.
Economics is for everyone. That's the takeaway message.
The message I tell the audience every time, everything we do in economics is a choice. There's nothing natural. It's not like coastal erosion. You don't just have to accept it.
Totally.
And better choices can lead to better outcomes.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, even on, you know, comparing this to the climate crisis frame of public policy, you can't negotiate with physics or chemistry, but we can negotiate with and we can change our rules. We don't live in a game of Monopoly, which was also invented in order to teach children about the pitfalls of an economy that is premised on land speculation and luck. And hey, what have we gone and done?
I was going to say that's a different episode.
Yeah.
Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you all soon. So thanks again to Chlöe for joining us on the podcast. Right now, we'll look at some of the headline numbers in the economy. And this is a week where we've got further indications that all is not well in the economy and how dependent we are upon imported energy. Oil prices briefly rose as a consequence of the conflict in Iran and Israel, driven by fears that the Iranian regime would close the Straits of Hormuz, which is a waterway in the Arabian Gulf. This would see oil prices rise to somewhere around $110 a barrel, and it would make 91 in New Zealand around 350, 375 on the forecourt. If that happens, then inflation targets right now will be meaningless, and we'll see a huge cost of living spike. Thankfully, as of filming, that hasn't yet happened, and we hope that it continues not to happen, but it's another indication as to how we need to move away from an economy which is quite so dependent upon oil. We also saw the Westpac McDermott Miller indicator about employment confidence. Now, this is a survey that looks at employees and asks them how confident they feel about their jobs and how confident they feel about things like pay rises. And we produce a composite number. Anything above 100 shows an economy and a workforce that's confident about the future and confident about pay rises in the future. The score at this last measure for June was 88, well below 100. Now, this is a low last seen during the very depths of COVID and during the very depths of the GFC. It suggests that there's real challenges in the labour market. And one of the things we're also seeing is increased lengthening times on job seeker. So people go on job seeker, they're not coming off as quickly. And as a consequence, the longer they spend in there, it's showing real signs of labour market stress. Now, the labour market is a lagging indicator for the economy. It's the thing that tends to happen last. So that suggests that what's happening in the economy right now is much worse than perhaps we've been led to believe. We also saw imports fall in New Zealand. Now, many of us think that imports falling might be a good thing, but it actually suggests again that consumers are keeping their hands in their pockets. And we had a piece of evidence this week showing that credit card data is now down at levels last seen in 2012. So spending in the economy isn't happening. Spending in the economy isn't happening. That then leads to people being worried about their jobs, business investment doesn't occur, and we go round and round this cycle. So again, this week, more data telling us that, again, we should be careful about using that last GDP number, that 0.8% increase, in thinking that's likely to continue. And in fact, ANZ this week downgraded their forecasts for GDP. Next quarter was supposed to be 0.4%. They've now penciled in 0.1. So there's plenty of data to look out for, but much of it is telling us to be very careful about the future. Now, thank you all so much for joining us here on the Locked Out podcast. We hope you found it in parts both maddening and in parts enlightening. Next week, we want to talk to you hopefully about the Māori economy, and we'll be talking with some special guests about that. If you've enjoyed the show this week, please give us a review or a recommendation on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you download. Locked Out looks forward to talking with you more next week. Don't work too hard. Goodbye.